Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox Inside the Racial Pharmacon, a podcast examining anti-racist theories and practices aimed at dismantling destructive identitarian politics and ideologies, both in the US and abroad. Please note that discussions deal with very difficult subject matter, so every episode comes with a general content warning.
And I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, Associate Professor of English, as well as both Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities here at St. Olaf College. This podcast is part of the programming brought to you by the Bolt Chair Endowment, so special thanks to the Bolt family for making this programming possible. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And now, the show. Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox. I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, and I know that I'm dressed like I should be reading a Christmas book to a bunch of kindergartners in front of a fireplace at some public library, but that's obviously not the case. I am recording from downtown Minneapolis, where it's currently -4 degrees, -15 or -20 with the wind chill, and it's going to get colder tonight. We're probably going to reach something like -35 with the wind chill by tomorrow morning. So yeah, my place is mostly brick walls, so it absorbs the cold really well, and it's old, so it's got a lot of cracks and it gets very drafty. And so there's a nice cold -something wind or draft circulating in my place, thus the warm gear. So yeah, that's the reason why I'm dressed like a, I don't know, lumberjack, elf, grandpa, whatever. Anyway, we won't be talking about Christmas today, nor will we be talking about public libraries. For those of you that were excited based on the outfit. Instead, we'll be talking about the non-existent left in this country and the implications of pretending that there is a left wing party when there isn't, and what that does or allows fascism to do, specifically authoritarian thinking, its infiltration into things like identity politics, and how that creates different variations on fascism. So today we'll be discussing the manner in which authoritarian thinking infiltrates American politics and how this problem has been intensified by what some scholars and activists call the fascist drift or the fascist creep, which is essentially a way of explaining how fascist ideas and practices infect both sides of the left-right political divide, resulting in what I call ambidextrous fascism, a type of fascist thinking capable of masking itself behind a liberal and or conservative position. Essentially, it's a type of fascism that's capable of using both the left and the right. Expanding on this theme will require more than one episode, so today will be dedicated primarily to examining the reductive politics around the left-right divide, what the absence of a leftist party entails, and how this absence leads to a false equivalency that allows fascism to creep or drift from right-wing extremism into leftist politics. We'll try to include plenty of definitions and illustrations in order to help elucidate some of these ideas for viewers and listeners who may be unfamiliar with them or who may be unaware of how fascism can migrate from one political ideology to another. So if some of these ideas are new to you, you might find this episode beneficial. It's first important to note that the left-right divide is mostly ideological because in the US, there hasn't really been an established unified leftist political movement and or party for some time now. The failure of leftist politics in the United States is currently evident in the ongoing tensions we're witnessing within the Democratic Party, between liberal centrists or moderate Democrats and the so-called progressive elements of that party. This was symbolically obvious in President Biden's one-year anniversary marathon press conference, where he addressed the question of whether or not he was pulling the country left. Here is a quote from CBS News that includes President Biden's response, and I apologize that it is a tweet, but it includes the actual quote. Most of our news is being circulated via tweets now, so we live in a Twitter world, I guess. President Biden responded to the question of whether or not he was pulling the country left with the following quote: "I am not Bernie Sanders. I'm not a socialist. I'm a mainstream Democrat. If you notice, 48 of the 50 Democrats supported me in the Senate on virtually everything I've asked," end of quote. And I think it's interesting that he says 48 out of 50. He doesn't name the latest two Democratic senators to not side with him, Manchin and Sinema specifically. He highlights Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders is one of the 48 that did back him on a lot of his legislation. So I think it's interesting who he named and who he did not name. And by he, I mean President Biden. Biden clearly differentiated his outdated and extremely naive centrism from any progressive politics by reiterating the fact that he is a, quote, mainstream Democrat, thereby creating distance between him and Bernie Sanders, America's poster politician for a radical leftism. And the reasoning behind Biden's adamant defense against being called a leftist, which is an absurd accusation. He's nowhere near the left, but I think it's symbolic of the general ignorance that characterizes this country's misunderstanding of politics. Anyway, Biden's defense against being called a leftist is underscored by the fact that he knows that much of his political success will depend on returning to normal or to a status quo as soon as possible. The problem is that this ongoing pandemic keeps interrupting the return to normal or status quo, especially economically, with many working class people realizing that a return to normal is not a return to a life that has or will benefit them personally in any material manner or even financially. In other words, a lot of people are finding out that a return to normal for them is a return to a life that they're not interested in living anymore. In fact, the pandemic has helped many workers understand that they exist within a socioeconomic and political system that does not prioritize their interests, beginning with their personal health and well-being. In fact, they live in a system that will sacrifice them individually in terms of their health and well-being, as we're seeing right now with the burnout that's taking place with frontline healthcare workers. Nurses are leaving their staff jobs for the freedom of being a traveling nurse and being self-employed. A lot of people are leaving child care jobs simply because they are also burnt out. A lot of people are leaving their positions as caretakers in retirement homes because they are also burnt out. And a lot of people are striking at plenty of factory jobs across the country, whether it's Frito-Lay, whether it's Kellogg's, or Amazon, if they're allowed to, because Amazon's, infamous for busting union efforts or unionizing efforts. So a lot of people, a lot of working class people are realizing that they are stuck in a system that does not have their best interests in mind, and they are tired of existing within such a system, and they're calling that out by quitting their jobs, by leaving their jobs and taking up other jobs. And this problem is still taking place right now. So just quickly to summarize some of the points that I just covered, Biden is a mainstream Democrat, and the key part of that definition is mainstream. Biden defends the status quo because he is a champion of the status quo, and he is desperate to return to normal, since that will guarantee that his political policies are succeeding, especially because wealth is the biggest indicator of well-being in this country, which is why we tend to measure the health of the market or the health of the economy in terms of well-being, i.e. health. However, the mainstream or status quo has been painfully failing, if not disappearing, under the new normal introduced by the pandemic. A new normal that still lacks clarity in terms of what it will mean for our daily lived experience in the future or in the present moment. And also note that Biden defended his mainstream position by distancing himself from a person, Sanders, who calls himself a democratic socialist. The main reason Sanders is labeled a socialist by people like Biden is because he tends to champion causes that bypass the financial interests of the wealthy in exchange for policies that benefit the majority of the population, which is why Sanders is extremely unpopular with the wealthy elite on both sides of the political divide. Bernie, who isn't really a socialist, but does advocate openly for more social programs that benefit working class families and individuals over corporate interest, is framed by Biden as an extreme in order to position himself as a centrist, as a defender of a status quo that seems comfortable living with wealth and equality in the US. And just to be clear, Sanders is not a Marxist or an anti-capitalist, which is why he is technically not a socialist, rather a socialist Democrat. He's in favor of reforming the current system, but he is not in favor of replacing it with something more radically lefty, let's say. So Biden is consciously calling out Bernie Sanders, who has supported his legislative agenda in many ways, simply because it's a way of Biden saying, look, I'm not a socialist like Bernie Sanders. I'm not a leftist. I'm a mainstream Democrat. So if the president is a mainstream Democrat and not a leftist, then what is he? That's the key question we'll be unpacking in this episode. So some questions to address are, what is mainstream or centrist moderate? What is a mainstream or centrist moderate Democrat? I just asked that, I think. Is Sanders really an extreme leftist? Is extreme leftism even allowed in US politics? What is considered extreme on the right? And why are they not included, those positions that are right of conservative? Why are those positions not included in debates about championing working class causes? There are other questions that are equally important to ask, but I think those are a good sampling. So let's start with the question of the left's failure in this country and why the Democratic Party is no longer representative of working class politics, which will allow us to transition to the use of culture wars by the right to distract from working class political organizing, thereby opening the doors to the possibility of a fascist drift or a fascist creep. The Democratic Party used to be the establishment's leftist political outlet for a disenfranchised working class. However, the Democratic Party's betrayal of working class struggles, in addition to their alliance with business interests, has resulted in visible acrimony and some embarrassingly public feuds, which are evident in current debates like whether or not congressional representatives should be allowed to engage in stock trading, considering their positions of privileged information and influence regarding the market, specifically legislative laws that impact it, like immigrant labor laws or establishing a federal minimum wage or environmental policies that introduce some kind of regulation into certain industries like the energy sector, etc. Some people started asking whether or not it's ethical or if it makes any sense for congressional representatives to engage in stock trading when they have access to this privileged, what is essentially insider information. So here's a piece from the Washington Post. It's an opinion by the Washington Post's entire editorial board. And they come to the radical conclusion that no, congressional representatives should not be allowed to trade in individual stocks because of the reasons that I just mentioned. In fact, Representatives Chip Roy of Texas and Abigail Spanberger of, I believe, Virginia, are introducing a bipartisan bill, one Republican, one Democrat, co-authoring a bill entitled the Trust in Congress Act, which I think is hilarious because if we need to trust in Congress, then there's obviously a lot of distrust around Congress. But they first introduced this bill last year when news broke out that numerous lawmakers, i.e. congressional colleagues of theirs, some of their peers in Congress, were making questionable stock trades in the pandemic's early days, when Congress was receiving frequent closed-door briefings by health and national security officials. Ms. Spanberger said that, or that, quote, "This is ridiculous. How is this even allowed?" So here you have two low-ranking, middle-ranking of Democratic representatives and Republican representatives in the House, asking how is it even possible for congressional representatives to engage in individual stock trading. So after realizing that this is the case, they're trying to pass a law that will prohibit congressional representatives from doing this because of their privileged position as public servants. However, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi stands as who is one of the wealthiest members of Congress, and she has progressively become wealthier or gotten wealthier while she's been in Congress. So there's a correlation between her time in Congress and the increase in her overall net worth, if you will, or her wealth. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, one of the wealthiest members in Congress, is one of the biggest roadblocks to this new bill that will prohibit members of Congress from individual stock trading. Her husband, Nancy Pelosi's husband, has been a frequent trader over the years. So there's obviously a relationship between individual stock trading and Nancy Pelosi's family, which is probably one of the reasons she does not want to ban herself and her family from doing this, because her husband is involved in this and they happen to be one of the wealthiest families in Congress. So last month, Ms. Pelosi stunned, this key word here being used by the editorial board of the Washington Post, stunned many, including this editorial board, when she defended congressional stock trading. So this is supposedly a leftist, a liberal Democrat, arguing in favor of Congress being able to continue to engage in individual stock trading. She argued that it's enough that lawmakers have to disclose their trades for the public to see. So for her, the fact that they're supposed to report what they earn through stock trading at the end of the year is enough transparency to allow this to continue to happen. The problem is that 54 members of Congress failed to disclose their trades on time in the past 2 years, and not all of them seem willing to disclose, just like President Trump never disclosed his income tax returns. A lot of members of Congress don't disclose their insider stock trading, and it's not like there's an insider stock trading police out there that's going after members of Congress, again, because members of Congress are the people that appoint some of these quote unquote investigators. So you have one part of Congress, in fact, a bipartisan contingency within Congress, trying to pass a law that will disallow everyone in Congress from engaging in stock trading based on their privileged position as members of Congress. And yet you have the leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, one of the wealthiest people in Congress, saying, no, we should be allowed to continue doing this. I am not in favor of creating this new trust in Congress bill that will become a law prohibiting members from Congress in engaging in individual stock trading. So that's a glimpse into why the left has failed in this country. As Nancy Pelosi's defense of congressional stock trading indicates, top leaders within the Democratic Party are unwilling to sacrifice the potential for financial gain, despite having what many consider to be privileged access to information that gives individuals within Congress an unfair advantage as far as stock trading, especially during tumultuous times like the beginning of a pandemic. This unwillingness to agree to an economic arrangement that offers a more transparent, thus fair and more even potential distribution of wealth in the US, again shows how this so-called leftist party prioritizes the self-interest of its leadership instead of ensuring the general well-being of all Americans. Such blatant dismissals of working class concerns betray some of the motivations behind Biden's desperate attempts to reinstate a status quo that has financially benefited politicians on both sides of the left-right political divide. And it should be noted that many of the bills aimed at prohibiting congressional stock trading are also coming from other individuals that are authoring their own version of something like this with very different political aims, in my view. I think a lot of these new bills drafted by specific individuals have more to do with the upcoming midterm elections. In other words, it's their way of posturing, it's their way of engaging in certain speaking points that are supposed to indicate a concern for working class struggles. But at the end of the day, like in most election cycles, it ends up being pure posturing and promising and very little delivery on those promises. Thus, it's kind of easy to see why it's easy to see that even when they have political power to implement much needed changes to the way that our political economy functions, again, evident in the mass worker walkouts currently happening across the nation, Democrats seem unwilling to use that influence to empower working class people at the expense of a wealthy elite. This was a major point of contention even last year when Biden's spending plan was being debated back in November, as the plan was found to benefit the wealthy through a tax deduction cap that would benefit the richest 10% of individuals. And here again is a Washington Post article that explains in detail how the second biggest program in the Democrat spending plan, which was up to, I think, $2 trillion, would give billions of dollars to the rich. And by the rich, they are talking about the richest 10% of income earners. And so just to quote from the article, on Friday, the House passed President Biden's Build Back Better, I guess I repressed the better part, legislation. The roughly $2 trillion social spending bill includes investments in clean energy and affordable childcare. Awesome, thumbs up, way to go. Very good causes to invest in. But it also includes a $275 billion tax cut that would almost exclusively benefit high-income households over the next 5 years. The measure is expected to change in the Senate, where Senators Bernie Sanders, surprise, surprise, and Bob Menendez are crafting a less regressive form of SALT cap relief. And what Menendez and Sanders are doing is trying to essentially get rid of that billions of dollars of benefits to the top 10%, top 10% of the richest individuals in a particular community. So what we have in the US is a two-party system that is too often defined in terms of a simplistic left-right binary, when in reality, both parties serve a system that increases their wealth in exchange for their acquiescence to a capitalist status quo, regardless of how unjust, inhumane, and destructive such a status quo has proven to be. And we're seeing a lot of this right now with the hurry up and get back to work, or should we get back to work, or should we open schools or not open schools, and should we dictate, mandate masks wearing or not, or vaccines, etc. A lot of that has to do with how do we bring back the economy. Very little of it has to do with the individual well-being of the population, which is why, sorry, that's just downtown living, which is why I think the issues of opening schools and in what manner, and the issues of going back to work are centered right now as some of the most important problems to address, because they're both tied to the economy. Schools in a less direct way, but obviously mandates around vaccinating workers, or mandates around closing or opening businesses and what type of businesses, or whether you should show vaccination status in order to be allowed to dine indoors, etc. All these things have less to do with the actual well-being of individuals and more to do with the economy. And that's a sad but kind of, I think, obvious truth at this point. Even politicians that enjoy widespread popular support can't escape the contradictions of serving in a supposed democratic government that itself answers to a highly undemocratic economic system. It's important to note that celebrity politicians like Trump and political celebrities like Obama are not opposed to the financial benefits that arise from their political influence, regardless of their party affiliation. Rarely will you see a politician on either side of the left-wing political divide run for office on a platform that would tax corporations and the wealthy elite at the same rate that they tax the general population. That's definitely one thing that Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have in common. They've all been Wall Street presidents. And here's a meme or graph or picture, whatever, that I just got off the internet. It's widely circulated. And it here represents a left-right divide back, I think, when obviously Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump in 2016. It also includes two British politicians. I think that's Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn on the left there. So we're going to cross them out because they're not involved in this US politics conversation because they are British. And in their place, we'll just insert Obama and Bush because Bush, Obama, and Trump are the three presidents that precede Joe Biden, who will include down there next to Hillary Clinton, where he belongs. Anyway, the depressing reality in the US at least, but also in places like the UK and France and most of neoliberal capitalist first world nations, if you will. The depressing reality is that both parties on either side of the left-right political divide answer almost exclusively to a corporate capitalist elite that donates generously to both parties, continually ensuring that corporate interests take priority over our general social welfare. This is why billionaires hardly pay taxes if they do at all and can take vacations in outer space. There's a nice picture of cowboy, space force cowboy. How's that? While people on the ground literally die at their workplaces. And yes, I'm talking about Jeff Bezos, Space Force cowboy, and Elon Musk. I'm just going to call Elon no, I probably shouldn't go there. Never mind. There's this great picture where he was supposedly going to be the vice presidential candidate along with Kanye West. So I wanted to call him Kanye's sidekick, but I'm afraid I'll get in trouble for that. So pretend I didn't say that, even though I don't think I can get in trouble for calling Elon Musk Kanye Brown's sidekick, since he at least posed in the picture where Kanye was announcing his presidential run, which lasted all of a month or two. I don't know. But anyway, yes, I'm talking about people like Bezos and Elon Musk, who, according to Forbes and ProPublica, average less than 3.5% in taxes paid, while the average American earning around 70,000, we're talking about billionaires, right, who pay less than 3.5% in individual income tax versus, average Americans who earn around $70,000 and pay 14%. That's like 4 times what these people pay in taxes, proving rather that the working class keeps rich people wealthy. This has been, and this will be the case in a capitalist consumer society like ours. Working class people are the people that keep the rich wealthy. And here's a nice Forbes, getting away from the Washington Post, article that highlights how people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and even Warren Buffett get away with paying very little to no income taxes here. And I'm just going to scroll past the first 2 bullet points, which kind of summarize what I've already said, just to highlight the statistics around Jeff Bezos and Musk specifically. Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos paid a true tax rate of 0.98%, so not even 1%, less than 1% in taxes, as his wealth grew by a staggering $99 billion. So his wealth increased by $99 billion between 2014 and 2018, during which he reported individual income of $4.2 billion, but paid an income tax rate of less than 1%. So, and the rest of us are paying 14%. 99 billion, less than 1% in taxes. Elon Musk, the billionaire CEO of Tesla, saw his wealth balloon by 13.9, almost $14 billion during the same time period. He reported over $1.5 billion in income, but paid a tax of less than 3.3%, I think, 3.27%. And even in 2007, Bezos paid no federal income tax, and Elon Musk in 2018 also paid no income tax. So isn't that nice? I don't remember a year where I didn't pay an income tax. I did actually when I was an undergraduate student. And the reason why I wasn't asked or compelled to pay an income tax is because poverty. I was literally too poor to pay taxes, like a lot of people. So that's why some of us don't pay taxes. It's not because we're super rich, it's because we're poor enough, not that the government's like, keep your chump change. So one of the main points I'm trying to make in this simultaneous let me rephrase that. One of the main points I'm trying to make is that the simultaneous blurring and redefining of the left-right political divide can be explained in terms of two major shifts in American political thinking and strategizing. First are the coordinated efforts at undermining the establishment of a working class political party, which Democrats traditionally championed but no longer seem seriously committed to. And I again refer to Biden's clear differentiation from Sanders, who is known for visibly aligning himself with working class political interests. Second, in addition to the lack of a working class political party, and I use the term party only to stay within the discursive parameters of the US political system, which I would ideally dismantle and rebuild from scratch. But that's an entirely different conversation for a different time. In addition to the lack of a working class political party, there is the sophisticated weaponization of culture wars aimed at entrenching left-right political divides that bypass the very idea of class warfare. And by class warfare, I mean the mutually beneficial relationship between the interests of the wealthy and our government representatives. When government representatives and the wealthy conspire to create laws that disenfranchise the majority of working class Americans, that is class warfare. So hopefully that clears that up. Instead of talking about the collusion between government and private interests, we are continually encouraged to focus on culture wars centered on identity politics. In other words, we are encouraged to aggressively debate idiotic problems like the war on Christmas, cancel culture wars, cake wars over gay weddings, and even bathroom wars for transgender people. But we are continually dissuaded from talking about the economic disparities that have become much more polarized as a result of strategic efforts aimed at disempowering the majority of the population, at least enough to make us dependent on the wealthiest 1% of the individuals, most of whom own the means of production. So I'm not trying to take away from the importance of some of those debates like transgender, the right of transgender people to use the restrooms that they feel are more aligned to their identities. I think that's a very important right, but it's a civil right that is centered as one of the most important debates happening in this country. And I think that is done in order to keep us from talking about things like economic justice and the growing disparity between the wealthy and the disenfranchised, people who are working class or impoverished and living in poverty, impoverished. Sorry if I misspoke or mispronounced that. But I think that the reason why we're encouraged to not focus on that is because that disparity is growing, and a lot of our government officials are, shall we say, colluding again, conspiring, or in agreement with this arrangement that makes them wealthier while it disempowers the rest of us. Therefore, you're going to see a continual discussion of some of these culture wars as more important than the economic injustice that is taking place in this country, especially during a pandemic, and especially regarding things like the eviction of houseless people from temporary housing camps and public parks and things of this nature. It is inhumane, but it shows what our government prioritizes: property over people, unfortunately. And we have politicians that are more than willing to back that up because the corporations and the wealthy elite interests that they protect and represent are the ones that put them in political power in the first place. It's a vicious cycle that disempowers the rest of us. So here's a meme, speaking of culture wars, that demonstrates, probably unwittingly, how politics becomes a spectacle of identity rather than the practice of interacting with other humans for the purposes of improving the social order. And I apologize to those that might find this meme offensive, but I will be critiquing the simplistic thinking behind it. So it's not an endorsement by any means. In fact, I think it's ridiculously reductive and simplistic, intellectually speaking. So here, essentially, what we have is the transformation of a political division of a right-wing politics and a left-wing politics that is transformed into a cultural war that is centered on identities, in this case, gendered and sexual identities, but that nevertheless, if you notice, adheres to the left-right political division. So, which is why the meme is divided into a left wing and a right wing, with a very ominous warning at the bottom that one must choose wisely between, I guess, one of these two sides of the picture, because the future of America depends on it. In other words, the side that you choose will end up being reflective of what America will look like in the future. So there's a few things going on here, ideologically speaking, in terms of trying to manipulate someone's thinking just based on this simplistic visual. First, what we have is politics represented in terms of cultural difference. And as I said already, the cultural differences here are focused primarily on sexual and gendered identities. Second, it's typical that there are certain tropes that are included in this meme where your physical appearance is somehow reflective and indicative of your politics and your ethics. In other words, the way you look, weak or strong, is indicative of your political position. Whether you are considered conventionally attractive or unattractive is indicative of your political position. In other words, there's a conflation of the aesthetics of an individual and how they appear to the world and the politics that they represent. In other words, to put it simply, your personal appearance reflects your politics. And in this case, it's a very strategic choice of body shapes. It's a very strategic choice of who is included in the picture, because one side is supposed to represent an attractive, strong version of the American nation and the people that belong to it, its citizenry, its the American nation in terms of the individuals that compose it. And the other side is supposed to also represent that potential future, but it's obviously framed in terms of marginalized sexual gendered identities. Therefore, its marginalization is meant to come across as both weak and unattractive, whereas the right-hand side of the picture is meant to come across as unified, strong, and attractive. And you can tell that just by the choice of body types, the choice of posturing. On one side, you have three individuals that seem to be in a dorm room who are just posing for a selfie, probably on their way to some kind of party. And on the right, you have people that seem to be at a Trump rally engaging in what seems to be the Pledge of Allegiance. So that unification also speaks to hegemony, right? On the right side, you have people that look alike and seem to be on the same page, to put it simplistically, versus the left side is supposed to be representative of some type of diversity. Again, diversity here represented in terms of sexual and gender fluidity. The one thing that I found funny about the meme is that I think every single person is white, or could be easily identified as white, which I don't think the person who made the meme took into account. So kind of a funny tell, if you will. But diversity is equated in this picture in terms of left-right. Diversity is equated with a kind of weakness, with a kind of corruption, if you will, whereas the hegemony, the sameness, the identity, the unification that's represented on the right suggests some kind of normalcy, if not some kind of healthiness and well-being. And this is a very easy case in which the left and right-wing political positions are transformed into cultural differences, and those cultural differences are indicative of the politics themselves. Thus, the way that, again, you look and the way that you practice your sexual identity or your gendered identity is going to be reflective of your politics. However, what is not obvious, but extremely important, is the fact that there is no evidence that an individual from one side could not, in fact, partake in the same practice as the other side. And I represent this in this new version of the meme by this white line. That individual on the left who is wearing glasses and a black dress could easily change their wardrobe and attend a Trump rally and possibly even be a Trumpist. They just happen to be a Trumpist that attends rallies, but on certain weekends engages in dorm parties where they're comfortable with their gender fluidity, right? So that is already the case. There are people who do that, live double lives in that sense. And it's very possible your cultural identity does not necessarily determine your political affiliation and vice versa. For me, more importantly, is that there's no evidence that all of these people don't in some way or another suffer some kind of similar economic disenfranchisement. In other words, having economic struggles is not particular to one side or the other in terms of this meme. Thus, people on both sides of this left-right cultural divide, because this is not labeled as political, the politics is implied, but what's being highlighted is a cultural difference, in this case, again, sexual and gendered identity. There is no evidence that the people on the left may not have a lot of economic struggles that the people on the right also have. In other words, there may be a lot of solidarity between these two culturally different groups in terms of politics. So this left-wing divide that is framed in terms of an identity politics or a cultural difference is meant to distract us from the potential solidarity that may exist there, represented by these red lines of an economic struggle, of something that we can all get behind, like the bipartisan bill right now in the House is probably not going to make it through Congress that Nancy Pelosi opposes, where you have two representatives basically saying that there is something wrong with members of Congress engaging in insider stock trade, individual stock trading. I call it insider constantly because to me, that's what it is. One second. Now, if you're a moderate Democrat, liberal, or Republican conservative, then you're probably invested in some culture war already, say current debates around critical race theory or the benefits of vaccination or vaccine mandates, two very hot topics at public school board meetings. Who would have thought that school board meetings would have become the center of American politics at the moment? But that's where a lot of stuff is happening. However, debating the very idea of class warfare, the coordination between politicians and wealthy elite class in order to maintain both the wealth of that 1% or the wealth of the wealthiest class and maintain the political power of politicians and the kind of like mutually beneficial relationship those two groups have, that type of class warfare. That's something that is foreign to most of us, since it's usually framed in terms of an extremist political identity. Usually it's called communism in this country, and not a socioeconomic structural problem inherent to a capitalist political economy, one that unjustly and unevenly impacts the entire US population. And that is not something that I would call communism. It's something that I would call basically your objective social scientific critique. This is a social science observation that, yes, in the United States, the economic system benefits a very small percentage of the population while disenfranchising the majority of the population in order to benefit that smaller class. And yes, politicians do assist in this uneven distribution of wealth. I think it's very hard to argue against that reality in our nation. So To criticize capitalism, however, in this country means that you're basically a communist, which is an unacceptable political position to take. Nobody comes out as a politician and runs as a communist. They're just almost guaranteed not to win based on decades of propaganda that we have circulated around what that term actually means. And it's in all, for all practical purposes, communism is an unacceptable political position to have in this country. Real Americans, or people that call themselves patriots, and there's plenty of people in, driving around with flags on their cars now and flags on their trucks. And it's kind of scary moment where you see so many flags circulating in the country. It's usually not a good sign that it's a unified nation. It's usually a sign that it's a divided nation, and one half believe that they are the true patriots or defenders of the nation. So real Americans or patriots cannot believe in and are dissuaded from learning more about things like class warfare because it's considered to be a uniquely communist ideological concept. As a nation that defeated the Soviet Union, being a communist in the US is essentially regarded as an out-of-bound or extremist position. And I represent this in this kind of simplistic illustration here, the left-right political divide in the US, because it shows how it excludes a position that is left of liberal. So here you have the notion of patriots at the top, and you have the 5 positions of communist, liberal, moderate, conservative, and fascist represented at the bottom, with moderate being your centrist position. And you have on the right, the conservative, on the left, liberal. And in a lot of other places, you keep going in this country, that's usually where it stops, except for the right. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So here's a simple illustration of how the left-right political divide excludes a position left of liberal, thus the exclusion of a communist position, for example, which is why it's not allowed. But it does not disavow a position right of conservative, which many refuse to call fascist because that is supposed to be an out-of-bounds position itself, considering the role the US played in defeating fascist regimes during World War II. This is why the term is crossed out, thus the indirect dashed line that flirts with conservatism, but essentially settles on fascist. In other words, that dashed line seems to go down directly towards conservatism, but then takes a hard right turn towards fascism, pun not intended. Fascism in the US is instead redefined in terms of patriotism. So people who are essentially fascists, very few of them call themselves fascists. You see people like the Patriot Front, you see people associated with the Oath Keepers. Those people don't call themselves fascists. So they call themselves something like nationalists or ethno-nationalists or populists, or they'll choose a different term than fascism in order to differentiate or distance them from the politics of the regimes that the US defeated, like, Nazism during World War II. Even though at the end of the day, their political ideologies are very much aligned with that type of political thinking. So essentially individuals like Nick Fuentes, the leader of the Grudner movement, or even Patriot Front, which suffered a major doxing last week. Those individuals, at the end of the day, align themselves with fascist politics, even if they don't call themselves as individuals fascists. Nevertheless, fascism in the US is instead redefined in terms of patriotism, a term that was highly politicized after 9/11 by conservatives. And I remember specifically how the term patriot and patriotism almost reemerged as a very commonly used term after 9/11, and is specifically started by right-wing politicians and pundits like Rush Limbaugh. This reframing reinforces the direct connection between patriotism and conservatism, thus the full or non-dashed lines that directly connect patriotism with a moderate position and a conservative position, while allowing for a drift that indirectly aligns patriotism with more extreme versions of conservatism, what is further to the right of conservative, which in this case is fascist, but it's not called fascist, it's called patriot or nationalist. Moreover, this drift towards conservative extremism and the ideological redefinitions it entails is why liberals as well as some moderate conservatives, were often accused of being unpatriotic during debates regarding a possible military invasion and occupation of Iraq, which became a reality in 2003. So back in 2003, if you were against the invasion and occupation of Iraq, you were essentially attacked and accused of being unpatriotic. Excuse me, I lost my place here. In summary, the moderate and conservative positions are undeniably connected to patriotism, while liberals are allowed a weak connection, thus the dashed line between liberalism and patriotism. And conservative extremists, despite being technically out of bounds politically, just like communists, are nonetheless included, even if their connection to patriotism is defined or depicted as ambiguous, right? Again, anything left of liberal is considered too extreme and thus unpatriotic. It's completely out of bounds, but anything right of conservatism is somehow tolerated. And in the last election cycle, President Trump emerged as someone who considered themselves right of traditional conservatism. The culturalification, I might have just made up a word. Yes, culturalification. I should put that, maybe I'll put a big banner across the screen that says culturalification, so you can write it down and start using it with your friends. The culturalification of class politics, and by culturalification, I'm talking about like the patriotic versus unpatriotic example, or going back to that meme of left versus right wing politics being reflected by the way an individual actually looks or acts in the world. The culturalification of class politics, and by class politics, I mean the geopolitical implications of invading Iraq to exploit its resources, going back to the 9/11 debates regarding the invasion and occupation of Iraq. The culturalification of class politics is in large part due, again, to the absence of class consciousness and the dismissal of class warfare as a structural reality within the US. Stated simply, the absence of a leftist political party. This inability to see how class warfare is reframed in terms of culture wars, like identity politics of real Americans or patriots versus terrorist sympathizers, is true even for people who suffer from socioeconomic disenfranchisement, but too often ascribe their alienation to some cultural phenomenon. So let's take a look at a common example. Here is an individual holding a sign that says illegal workers destroy living wages, surrounded by a lot of people who are waving American flags, which goes back to my previous point. And I am going to hypothetically narrate what I would assume someone like this person, and having grown up in Arizona, I hear a lot of this type of discourse, with the kind of discourse that this person is probably ascribing to, and the kind of rhetoric that they're probably used to hearing and repeating when making the argument that illegal workers destroy living wages. Again, I'm talking like that person in the picture, so this is not me. I'm a disenfranchised warehouse worker employed by a multi-billion-dollar corporation, think Amazon, who identifies as a white male and moderate conservative. We can even say moderate, doesn't even really matter for the purposes of this example. I cannot seem to achieve the middle-class lifestyle that my family traditionally enjoyed. And as a side note, this is the end of American social mobility that began with the implementation of neoliberalism around the late 70s and throughout the 80s. And the big reason why 40 years later, for example, a 30-year-old with a college degree cannot secure decent employment or even find a career and might be compelled to move in with their parents. So again, that is not accidental. This is a part of this class warfare that I've been describing. So again, getting rid of an established traditional working class party that is leftist in the traditional sense of the word, which has to do everything with socioeconomic justice. Anyway, back to the hypothetical. Within this hypothetical, I cannot blame the political lobby that my corporation engages in because it is an inalienable democratic right under our free market economy and parliamentary capitalist principles. Side note, our free market isn't really free, but we'll ignore corporate conglomeration for the purposes of this example. I, as a disenfranchised white male, therefore refrain from criticizing my employer. I can't criticize Amazon for what they do because it's a business and a business is allowed to run its business the way it runs its business. The problem for my disenfranchisement cannot be capitalism, cannot be my employer, it has to be something else. A lot of people think this way because they are not encouraged or taught to think in terms of class divisions and class warfare. So, even though my wages remain low and I like basic work benefits, I refrain from criticizing my employer and I don't have things like healthcare. But I will nevertheless instead blame the influx of undocumented immigrant workers as the reason for my socioeconomic stagnation. And my anger is then easily transferred to the political party that I perceive as aiding immigrant labor, in this case, the Democratic Party, though this is not actually true, especially at this particular moment in US history. The Democratic Party is not necessarily the champion of immigration at the moment, far from it. Thus, I, the individual in the picture, blame Democrats for allowing unchecked immigration, which is directly inhibiting my ability to achieve a middle-class lifestyle by watering down wages for real American citizens. So going back to the picture, illegal workers, i.e. undocumented immigrants, destroy living wages. And the key there is living wages. Undocumented workers don't impact your living wage. Living wage is determined by your employer and can be mandated by government if necessary, like raising the minimum wage. These things are real, and you can advocate for those things instead of blaming another group that, in fact, does not have access to the type of jobs that most middle-class Americans think immigrants are actually taking. So, and if I'm this person and I want to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, I can even blame a secret Jewish cabal for funding leftist politicians that I perceive as protecting immigrant laborers who then threaten my livelihood. And this conspiratorial anti-Semitic thinking is what I call the George Soros syndrome. And that's something that Fox News is fond of propagating occasionally, and something that circulates wildly online. It was even tied to the famous migrant caravan that Trump was obsessed with for a while. And everybody was blaming George Soros as somehow funding a bunch of poor people from Central America's, desire to walk and or drive or reach the United States by any means necessary. It was a first-class trip for most of them because of George Soros. Anyway, this oversimplified hypothetical demonstrates how a socioeconomic problem that is fairly obvious, wealth disparity, the shortage of well-paying jobs with benefits, for example, becomes obscured by a manufactured cultural bias. In this case, a left-right political binary where class warfare is associated with extreme leftist pro-communist politics, and American nationalism and patriotism is viewed as a right-wing or conservative cultural defense against an imagined foreign menace made up of immigrant caravans that is then packaged and sold as an existential threat. In other words, immigrant communists want to kill you and take your freedom. And literally, this is the way people on the right talk, a lot of pundits, right? They want to come kill you and take your freedom, as if your freedom can be taken away from you once you're dead. That's just, a logical discrepancy. So in this new graph, you can again see that the position left of liberal is out of bounds. It's not allowed. Communist is still crossed out, as is fascism, because again, people are not walking around calling themselves fascists, but instead are using the euphemisms of nationalist or patriot. So that position, right of conservative, is allowed to continue to exist and infiltrate politics, but whatever is left of liberal is strongly dissuaded even by the president of the United States, who is supposed to be leftist, who is supposed to be a liberal or left of liberal. What is concealed and not supposed to be, I understand that a president could run as a moderate, and I think Biden basically is a moderate centrist, and this is why the country is not succeeding at overcoming the various struggles that it encountered with the previous administration. I know some of that has to do with the pandemic, but the Biden administration needs to be held equally accountable for the way it handled the pandemic and its dismissal that it's almost over, we're out of it, we need to get back to normal, etc. We don't need to send out test kits to every American. Why should it? The evidence is there if you want to look into it. They have handled the pandemic in very irresponsible ways with a lot of mixed messaging. So they need to be held equally accountable. If we're going to critique the previous administration, we need to be equally able and willing to critique this one for its failings. Anyway, going back to the left-right political divide, that is essentially an ideological falsehood in the context of the US. What is concealed in this manufactured cultural debate, communists versus patriots, is the reality that our wealth disparity exists in large part because wealthy people don't contribute equally to society in terms of taxes. We saw that already with the Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos examples. And they secure and enlarge their wealth by backing politicians on both sides of the left-right political divide, liberal or liberal conservative divide, who will maintain this very unhealthy but normal status quo, particularly through the continual transformation of class warfare, like Amazon's unlawful union-busting tactics, into culture war fantasies propagated by demagogues on media outlets like Fox News and CNN alike. So, for example, here's Tucker Carlson framing Mike Lindell, a prominent Trump supporter who personally funded Stop the Steal rallies on behalf of Trump and was spending a large part of his own personal fortune trying to prove that the presidential election was rigged and that Trump was robbed, and he was allowed direct access to the president while Trump was still president during the last days in office, etc. So he's a wealthy individual and had direct access to the president of the United States, even though he comes across as kind of crazy. Here, Tucker Carlson is framing him as a victim of cancel culture, thus transforming a political economic issue, again, a wealthy political supporter aiding a potential coup because the 2016 presidential election results went against his guy, Donald Trump. So here's this transformation of a political economic issue, the relationship between wealthy and established politicians, into a cancel culture war. Again, bypassing issues of how wealthy individuals influence US politics, thus engaging in class warfare. So this is yet another example. Tucker Carlson has made a career of doing this, of transforming class issues into cultural issues that can be then reduced to identities and how you position yourself, and how you dress, and how you comb your hair, etc., rather than the political philosophies that you align with and the political practices that you back as an individual. And here's So the problem essentially is that in the United States, we have this simplistic thinking that feeds into a highly inaccurate but wildly popular model of American politics being either simply a binary of left-right divisions, or a more obvious framing of culture wars. And here we have another example that is framed in terms of a left-right political binary. Again, the simplistic way we tend to understand politics in this country. And this specific war that Tucker Carlson is engaging with the Honorable Candace Owens is about a song. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I think a lot of people are already familiar with that song. It made a lot of news for some reason, as opposed to the real problems that we need to be debating as a country. But Tucker decided to transform it into actual news. This is not news. But here, again, is an example of someone who is very knowledgeable about class warfare in this country, transforming a lot of those issues into culture wars that have nothing to do with the way we live our daily material lives, in terms at least of things like economic disparities. In conclusion, what the left-right political division in the US allows, especially in light of an absent left, is the development of a seemingly more comprehensive political model, like the horseshoe example, which integrates supposed gradations of left-right political positions along a spectrum. thereby offering more options within the existing binary. So here in the horseshoe, you still have the center, right, the moderate, and then you have the left, right, the liberal, and the right, the conservative, and that even allows for a far right, like a fascist, and a far left, like a communist, but it refrains from using that kind of established terminology in favor of something more ambiguous like far right and far left, which could easily be Trump and Sanders in the US, or in another context, it could be someone like, Hitler on one side and someone like, I don't know, sorry, I'm blanking out here, Rosa Luxemburg on the other. I mean, that's one version of juxtaposing the left-right position or far left, far right position, but one that's not encouraged in the United States. Most people don't even know who Rosa Luxemburg is. Anyway, moving on. That's a horseshoe example. And all I want to highlight is a false equivalency between left, right, far left, far right, as if though they are the same. And that's what the horseshoe model I think encourages. The persistence and proliferation of such reductive thinking serves to continually mystify our true political reality, one that consists of a complex network of political and socioeconomic positions, thus upholding the left-right binary either in terms of an ideological divide that takes the form of a line, much like a border between nations, or a spectrum of pre-established positions that gives the illusion of separate but equal gradations within the left-right divide, like the horseshoe model. It's kind of like a house with two wings divided into separate but equal rooms. That's what the horseshoe model wants to suggest. And here's an example of a modified horseshoe model that encourages us to think in terms of pro versus anti-establishment politicians, which is kind of absurd in that the equivalence between Sanders and Trump in this example is beyond disingenuous. Trump was never a blue-collar candidate, though he's never hidden his love of the poorly educated. And Sanders is not an anti-establishment politician, but he is definitely left of Clinton. So as you can see, you have neoliberal represented by Hillary Clinton. That's fairly accurate. Neoconservative represented by Bush. That's fairly accurate considering his, appointments of people like Rumsfeld and the fact that he ran with Dick Cheney for serious neocons. So those two are pretty accurate. Sanders as anti-establishment far left, I'm not, again, I don't agree with that, but I do agree that he's in favor of blue collar. None of these people are in favor of a revolution and their grassroots. I think that Trump pretends to be very grassroots, appeals to grassroots, but at the end of the day, he answers to the elite wealthy class. So the idea that that middle line that says today's political spectrum is vertical, the battle between left and right is irrelevant. There's a degree of truth to that, but it establishes false equivalences, like the fact that the far left, in this case Bernie Sanders, is the same as the far right, in this case Donald Trump. Donald Trump is an aspiring fascist who was willing to instigate a coup in the United States. Bernie Sanders wants like healthcare for all workers and better paying wages and more socioeconomic justice. He's not looking for a revolution. So at the end of the day, that horseshoe model is inaccurate, again, establishing a false equivalence, which we'll unpack next time, when in reality, Bernie Sanders just belongs right there next to Hillary Clinton, but a little to her left. So for our next episode, I'd like to explore the horseshoe model that has gained popularity due to a centrist bias and separate but equal formula applied to positions left of liberal and right of conservative. In essence, equating fascist and anti-fascist politics as equally out of bounds. An argument that makes no sense, but that nevertheless circulates as common knowledge. So until next time, we'll be unpacking the fascist drift and the fascist creep into leftist politics via things like identity politics. Until then, stay frosty, watch your six, and hasta luego, amigos, which means later, friends. Oh, and don't forget to please subscribe to future episodes if you enjoyed today's. Thanks.